Welcome centuries, the Qing Dynasty had presented itself as the guardian of China's unbroken civilization. The emperors in Beijing ruled from the Forbidden City, presiding over a realm whose mandarins, traditions, and Confucian order stretched back thousands of years. To the Chinese, theirs was the Middle Kingdom, the center of the world around which all else revolved. But by the late 17th century and into the 19th, this confidence had begun to crack. The dynasty itself was never as firmly rooted as it seemed. It was, after all, a foreign house, Manchu conquerors from the north who had imposed their rule in the 17th century. At first they brought strength, but over time, corruption, lavish court intrigues, and the slow rot of bureaucracy eroded their ability to govern. Provincial governors acted like kings of their own territories, and local landlords wielded more influence than distant imperial edicts. For the peasant, who lived on the brink of famine, little changed whether the man in Beijing was titled Son of Heaven or not. As China struggled with its internal decay, new pressures gathered from abroad. European ships appeared in Chinese waters, not with tribute, but with commerce and demands. By the 18th century, merchants from Britain, France, and other powers had arrived in large numbers. To the Europeans, China was a treasure house of silk, porcelain, and tea. To the Chinese elite, these newcomers were little more than barbarians at the gate, tolerated, but not respected. Yet the tide was turning. With their expanding navies and hunger for markets, these foreigners were no longer humble traders. They were forces of empire, and they would reshape China's destiny. Many later historians would point to this flood of merchants and foreign emissaries as the beginning of China's unraveling. In their wake came new treaties, new pressures, and a system of trade that increasingly left the Qing court humiliated. The dynasty's inability to adapt, to reform its taxes, its armies, or its relationship with the provinces, meant that foreign intrusion struck at a state already weakened from within. Ordinary Chinese could feel the change. The once proud empire that claimed to sit above the world was in fact being pulled into a new one. Coastal cities bustled with strange goods and foreign accents. Inland, rumors spread that silver was leaving the country faster than it arrived, that officials in Beijing had lost control. A quiet sense of unease settled in villages and towns alike. Meanwhile, across the sea, Japan was beginning to stir. Long isolated, it had opened to Western ideas and technologies with astonishing speed, and would soon become a mirror in which China could see its own decline. While the Qing court drifted, its neighbor was preparing for a leap into the modern age. The old order, which had lasted for centuries, was fraying. What remained to be seen was whether it would bend or break. For centuries, China had looked upon its island neighbor with a mix of disdain and indifference. Japan, in the Chinese worldview, was small, peripheral, a distant pupil of Chinese civilization. Yet by the late 19th century, that perception collapsed in a single humiliating war. In 1894, Japan and China clashed over control of Korea, a peninsula long seen as a tributary state within China's sphere of influence. For the Qing court, this was not simply a military contest, but a test of its ability to maintain prestige in East Asia. What followed was a catastrophe. Japanese armies, organized along modern lines, disciplined and well-armed, swept aside Qing forces with startling ease. The Chinese navy, once a source of pride, was shattered at the Battle of the Yalu River. By 1895, the war was over, and the verdict was undeniable. The once proud Middle Kingdom had been defeated by a nation it had long dismissed as a cultural imitator. Japan took possession of Taiwan and, more significantly, cemented its ambitions for Korea and Manchuria. This was not only a strategic gain but also a symbolic turning point. The student had surpassed the teacher. The shock reverberated across Chinese society. Intellectuals who had once argued that China needed gradual reform were shaken to their core. How could an empire that had claimed to embody the pinnacle of civilization lose so decisively to what many still saw as a provincial state? The humiliation sparked debates in schools, newspapers, and tea-houses. Some demanded wholesale modernization along Western lines. Others clung stubbornly to tradition, fearing that to adopt foreign methods was to betray the soul of the nation. Japanese leaders, meanwhile, viewed their victory as the first step in a broader strategy. Korea and Manchuria were not ends in themselves. They were stepping stones. Beyond them lay China itself, vast, resource-rich, and weakened. Western observers took note as well. For Britain, France, and Germany, the war was proof that Japan had joined the ranks of modern powers, while China was a carcass waiting to be carved. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, which ended the war, deepened China's humiliation. Not only did it cede territory and pay crushing indemnities, it also opened more ports to foreign exploitation. Within China, the treaty was a national wound. Students and reformers who had once whispered about change now shouted for it in the streets. The defeat had transformed humiliation into urgency. And yet, even in this moment of crisis, the Qing court hesitated. Reform decrees were issued, then withdrawn. The Empress Dowager Cixi, who held true power behind the throne, feared that rapid modernization might destabilize her fragile regime. Her reluctance created a deadly paradox. Everyone knew change was necessary. Yet those in power resisted it. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Middle Kingdom found itself caught between past and future, unable to move forward, unable to stand still. The war with Japan had been a warning shot. Far greater storms were still to come. The defeat to Japan had left the Qing dynasty staggering. But it was not the only wound. Within the empire itself, the late 19th century became an age of revolts, some desperate, some hopeful, all pointing to the crumbling foundations of imperial rule. Across the countryside, ordinary people bore the weight of loss. Taxes rose to pay indemnities owed to Japan and the Western powers. Famine struck regions already exhausted by years of neglect. Secret societies and rebel groups flourished, whispering that the dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven, the divine legitimacy that once justified its rule. In 1898, a burst of reform briefly seemed to promise salvation. The so-called 100 Days Reform, spearheaded by the young Emperor Guangxu, sought to modernize government, education, and the military. But the experiment ended almost as soon as it began. Empress Dowager Cixi, fearing her own authority would be swept away, placed the emperor under house arrest and reversed most of the decrees. The empire lurched backward, paralyzed by its own guardians. This paralysis only fueled anger, and that anger erupted in the Boxer Rebellion of 1899. It began in the villages of northern China, where drought and poverty mixed with hatred of foreigners. To peasants, the railways, telegraph poles, and foreign missions were symbols of alien domination. Bands of martial artists and peasants, calling themselves the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, the Boxers, swore they could repel bullets with spiritual power. They attacked missionaries, Chinese converts to Christianity, and foreigners with brutal fervor. By 1900, their fury reached Beijing itself. Foreign embassies were besieged for weeks. The Qing court, torn between crushing the Boxers or using them as a weapon, hesitated once again. Cixi eventually declared support for the uprising, turning what had begun as a peasant revolt into an international crisis. The response was swift. An alliance of 8 foreign powers, Britain, Japan, Russia, Germany, France, the United States, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, marched on Beijing. Their armies stormed through northern China, looting, burning, and killing as they advanced. The Qing dynasty, nominally the master of the empire, could do nothing to stop them. The image of foreign soldiers marching through the Forbidden City was burned into the national memory as one of the most humiliating episodes in Chinese history. When the dust settled, the Boxer Protocol of 1901 imposed staggering indemnities and new humiliations. China was forced to allow foreign soldiers to be permanently stationed in Beijing, a constant reminder of its subjugation. For ordinary Chinese, the Boxer Rebellion was both a tragedy and a revelation. The dynasty had failed to protect them, failed to modernize, failed to resist foreign aggression. The rebellion's bloody end convinced many that the empire was beyond saving. Young intellectuals began turning to new ideas, republicanism, socialism, even the radical theories of Marx. Out of anger and despair, a new generation was preparing to dismantle a system that had lasted for over 2,000 years. The Qing had survived, but only just. The empire's days were numbered, and its rulers could not see that the fire of revolution was already burning beneath their feet. The new century dawned on an empire that had lost both confidence and control. After the Boxer humiliation, the Qing court scrambled to enact reforms, modern schools, limited military modernization, even talk of a constitution. But it was too late. The dynasty was a relic, limping forward while the world surged past. Across the provinces, resentment simmered. Warlords and provincial governors resented Beijing's weakness. Intellectuals whispered about new political systems, republics, parliaments, and democracy. Abroad, exiled revolutionaries organized tirelessly. Chief among them was Sun Yat-sen, a doctor turned political visionary who believed China could be reborn as a modern republic. In October 1911, the spark finally ignited. A mutiny broke out in Wuchang, a city along the Yangtze River. What began as a small garrison revolt quickly spread like wildfire. Provinces declared independence from the Qing court. The dynasty, already brittle, could not withstand the shock. Within weeks, the empire that had ruled for nearly 3 centuries was collapsing. By the end of the year, revolutionaries declared the establishment of the Republic of China. Sun Yat-sen, long exiled and chased by Qing authorities, was chosen as provisional president in January 1912. In Nanjing, he stood before supporters as the symbol of a new era, the end of imperial rule and the birth of a republic. Yet even in triumph, cracks appeared. Sun's government controlled only parts of the south, while in Beijing, the boy Emperor Puyi still sat on the dragon throne. He was just 6 years old, a child emperor surrounded by eunuchs and courtiers clinging to the last shreds of dynastic grandeur. Behind him stood Yuan Shikai, the most powerful general in China, who commanded the Beiyang army in the north. Sun Yat-sen, pragmatic and desperate to avoid endless civil war, struck a bargain. He stepped aside, offering the presidency to Yuan in exchange for Puyi's abdication. In February 1912, after 2,000 years of imperial rule, the mandate of emperors ended with a trembling stroke of a pen. The Son of Heaven had abdicated, and the empire was no more. But the revolution was not the clean break its leaders hoped for. Sun had dreamed of democracy and unity, but Yuan Shikai was a soldier, not a reformer. Power had shifted, but the structure of corruption, militarism, and regionalism remained. Still, for the first time in history, China called itself a republic. The streets of Beijing filled with both celebration and unease. What did it mean to be citizens, not subjects? Could the dream of unity survive the ambitions of generals and politicians? The Qing dynasty was dead, but the struggle to define China's future had only just begun. At the dawn of the Republic, many believed China had finally turned a corner. The emperor was gone, the Republic declared, and Sun Yat-sen hailed as a revolutionary father. But in practice, power lay in the hands of one man, Yuan Shikai. Yuan had long been a towering figure in late Qing politics, commanding the modernized Beiyang army and maneuvering with the instincts of a seasoned warlord. When he accepted the presidency in 1912, some hoped he might stabilize the fragile new republic. Instead, Yuan saw an opportunity, not to build democracy, but to consolidate his own authority. Almost immediately, he began tightening control. The fledgling parliament was harassed and manipulated. Opponents found themselves exiled, silenced, or worse. Yuan envisioned himself not merely as president, but as the indispensable strongman who could hold China together. For a nation fractured by decades of humiliation, some found his iron grip reassuring. But for others, it felt like betrayal, the promise of the 1911 revolution slipping into yet another dictatorship. Sun Yat-sen, unwilling to watch his dream be strangled, reorganized his followers into the Kuomintang, KMT, or Nationalist Party. They spoke of liberty and reform, but Yuan had the soldiers, the treasury, and the capital. He crushed opposition ruthlessly, dissolving parliament when it dared challenge him. Then, in 1915, Yuan made his most audacious move, announcing that the republic was flawed. He proclaimed himself emperor of a new dynasty, the Empire of China. To many, it was an astonishing act of hubris. After millennia of imperial rule had just been cast aside, here was Yuan attempting to resurrect it under his own name. Foreign powers looked on with confusion. Chinese intellectuals with outrage. Even his generals, who had once stood by him, turned away in disbelief. The gamble failed spectacularly. Provinces revolted. Newspapers ridiculed him. Students poured into the streets. Yuan had misread the mood of his age. After 1911, monarchy, any monarchy, was poison. Within a year, his so-called empire collapsed before it had even begun. Isolated and sick, Yuan died in 1916, his dream of a new dynasty buried with him. But his death did not restore stability. Instead, it left a vacuum. Without Yuan's iron hand, the fragile republic disintegrated. China fractured once more, not into emperors and republicans, but into countless warlords, each carving out their own dominions. The revolution had promised rebirth. Yuan's gamble had delivered chaos. What followed was an era of splintered authority, where loyalty was bought with silver and enforced by the gun. For ordinary Chinese, the dream of a united nation receded as warlords turned fields into battlegrounds and cities into fiefdoms. The republic had survived in name, but in reality, China was drifting once again into the abyss of fragmentation. When Yuan Shikai's ambitions crumbled into the dust, he left behind not a republic reborn, but a republic in ruins. The year was 1916, and with his death came the collapse of the fragile central authority he had held together. What followed is remembered as the warlord era, a time when the very idea of a unified China seemed little more than a memory. China fractured into pieces. Generals, governors, and opportunists carved out territories like feudal lords of old. Some ruled over vast provinces, others over a single city, but all commanded private armies more loyal to their paymaster than to any notion of nationhood. The dream of the Republic, declared so boldly in 1912, was reduced to a thin veil draped over endless civil strife. Life under the warlords was precarious. Peasants who had once been taxed by imperial officials were now squeezed by soldiers who demanded food, silver, or sons for their armies. Villages often shifted allegiance with each passing column of troops. To the ordinary farmer, it no longer mattered whether the banner overhead bore the name of a general, a revolutionary, or a self-proclaimed president. What mattered was survival. In the cities, the chaos took on different forms. Shanghai glittered with foreign wealth under its international concessions, but even there, gangsters and warlord-backed cliques battled for influence. Beijing, nominally the capital, was more a bargaining table where generals traded ministries like poker chips. Laws meant little. Power grew from the barrel of a gun. Foreign powers exploited the disunity with ease. Japan expanded its grip on Manchuria, demanding new privileges in 1915 with its infamous 21 demands. Britain, France, and others tightened their commercial hold over ports and railways. To them, China was no longer a sovereign nation, but a chessboard to be played upon. Yet amid this fragmentation, new forces stirred. Intellectuals and students were watching the chaos with fury. They spoke of the sick man of Asia, and asked how China could ever rise if its leaders behaved like bandits. Newspapers carried stories of Russia's Bolshevik Revolution, of nations redefining themselves in the wake of World War I. For many young Chinese, the warlord nightmare was proof that the old order, whether dynasty, strongman, or parliament, was incapable of saving the country. Something radically new would be required. The warlords themselves were not without vision. Some built railways or tried limited reforms, hoping to present themselves as modern rulers. But their rivalries consumed them. Coalitions rose and fell with dizzying speed, each alliance dissolving into betrayal and fresh war. China, once the heart of the world's greatest empire, was now a patchwork of fiefdoms. The land was balkanized, the people weary, the state little more than a memory. But in the shadows of this broken republic, revolutionaries and visionaries were preparing. For them, the warlord era was not only a tragedy, but also an opportunity, a chance to forge a new China from the wreckage. As China fractured under the warlords, one figure refused to surrender his vision. Sun Yat-sen, the man hailed as the father of the republic, returned to the political stage, determined to reclaim the promise of 1911. Exiled and betrayed more than once, Sun had become both a dreamer and a realist. He knew speeches alone would not unite China. Only power would. From his base in Guangzhou, Sun reassembled the Kuomintang, KMT, the Nationalist Party. His vision was simple yet audacious: end the chaos of the warlords, expel foreign domination, and build a strong, modern republic. But the KMT at this stage was fragile, underfunded and outgunned. Its survival depended on alliances, and Sun was pragmatic enough to seek them, even in unlikely places. That meant turning toward the Soviet Union. Moscow, eager to spread revolutionary influence in Asia, saw potential in Sun's movement. In 1923, Soviet advisors arrived in Guangzhou. They brought not just weapons and funds, but also organizational expertise. At their urging, the KMT began adopting modern party structures, discipline, and a military academy to train loyal officers. This infusion of Soviet strategy would transform the nationalists from a loose coalition into a formidable political force. Yet Sun Yat-sen was not content to rely on Moscow alone. He also extended a hand to China's fledgling Communist Party, CPC, founded only a few years earlier by radical students inspired by Marxism and the Bolshevik Revolution. The Communists were tiny in number, but Sun recognized their potential. In exchange for supporting his dream of national reunification, he allowed them to join the KMT in what would become known as the First United Front. For many observers, this alliance seemed improbable. Sun was a nationalist and a Christian, committed to democracy, while the Communists preached class struggle and revolution. But for the moment, both sides shared a common enemy: the warlords who held China hostage. Cooperation was a gamble, but it was also the only way forward. As Sun rebuilt his movement, he also sharpened his ideology. He articulated his three principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood. These were not abstract slogans. They were his answer to China's crisis. Nationalism to resist foreign domination, democracy to end the tyranny of warlords and emperors, and people's livelihood to lift the masses out of poverty. By the mid-1920s, Sun's efforts were bearing fruit. The KMT was no longer a provincial clique, but a rising national movement. Yet fate was unkind. In 1925, Sun died of cancer, leaving his work unfinished. His death plunged the party into uncertainty, but his vision endured. His portrait would continue to hang in classrooms, offices, and even rival camps, a reminder that he had dreamed of a China beyond division. As Sun's coffin was carried through the streets, mourners lined the roads in silence. The father of the republic was gone. But the seeds he had planted, in the KMT, in the alliance with the Communists, and in the dream of national unity, were about to grow in ways even he could not have foreseen. The First World War ended in 1918 with celebrations in Europe. But in China, the peace brought only bitterness. Despite having contributed laborers and resources to the Allied cause, China found itself betrayed at the Versailles Conference. The German concessions in Shandong, which Chinese delegates expected to be returned, were instead handed to Japan. For a nation already scarred by humiliation, this was another deep wound. On May 4, 1919, students in Beijing erupted in protest. They filled Tiananmen Square and the streets surrounding the capital, carrying banners, shouting slogans, and denouncing both the foreign powers and their own weak government. Their message was defiant: China would no longer accept humiliation. This outpouring became known as the May 4th movement, and it was more than just a protest. It was a cultural and intellectual earthquake. Across the country, students, workers, and intellectuals joined the call for renewal. Newspapers buzzed with fiery articles. Pamphlets circulated demanding an end to feudal thinking, corrupt officials, and blind submission to tradition. The young generation declared that if China was to survive, it must shed its old skin. They rejected Confucian orthodoxy, calling it a shackle that had left the nation weak. They embraced science, democracy, and new philosophies flooding in from abroad. Among these ideas was Marxism, which offered a radical explanation for China's suffering, exploitation by imperialists abroad and landlords at home. Out of this ferment, the Chinese Communist Party, CPC, was born in 1921. At first, it was little more than a handful of intellectuals gathering in a small room in Shanghai. But the energy of May 4th gave it momentum. The CPC saw itself not only as a political movement, but as the inheritor of the students' fire, the voice of a generation demanding dignity and justice. The Kuomintang too felt the tremors. For Sun Yat-sen and his successors, the May 4th spirit was a reminder that nationalism alone was not enough. The people wanted reform, modernization, and a future they could believe in. The question was whether the nationalists could deliver, or whether the communists, with their radical promises, would seize the mantle. But beyond ideology, the May 4th movement awakened something deeper, a sense of collective identity. For centuries, China had been a realm of provinces, clans, and villages. Now, students in Beijing, workers in Shanghai, and peasants in Hunan began to think of themselves as part of a single nation, wounded yet unbroken, demanding rebirth. In hindsight, May 4th was not merely a protest against Versailles. It was a turning point, when China's youth declared that the old world was dead and a new one had to be forged, no matter how painful the process. By the early 1920s, China's political future seemed balanced on a knife's edge. The May 4th generation had lit a fire that could not be extinguished. But the question remained, who would seize its momentum? Two forces rose from the chaos, the Kuomintang, KMT, strengthened by Sun Yat-sen's vision, and the newly formed Communist Party of China, CPC, inspired by Marxist ideals. On the surface, these two movements could not have been more different. The nationalists dreamed of a unified, modern republic guided by Sun's three principles of the people. The communists, meanwhile, preached revolution from below, promising to empower workers and peasants against landlords and capitalists. Yet both confronted the same obstacle, China's fragmentation under warlords and the shadow of foreign imperialism. It was the Soviet Union that saw an opportunity. Moscow, eager to spread its revolutionary model, extended a hand to both parties. Soviet advisors encouraged cooperation, reasoning that only a united front could defeat the warlords and begin China's transformation. In 1923, Sun Yat-sen agreed. The communists were allowed to join the Kuomintang as individuals, creating a fragile alliance bound more by necessity than trust. This first united front marked a new phase of China's struggle. Soviet influence was palpable. Advisors like Mikhail Borodin brought not just money and weapons, but also the organizational discipline that both parties desperately needed. A new military academy was founded at Whampoa, training young officers who would soon become central figures in China's wars. Among them was a sharp, ambitious cadet named Chiang Kai-shek. For the communists, the alliance was a golden opportunity. Small and weak on their own, they could now spread their message under the protection of a much larger movement. In villages liberated from warlords, they organized peasants, distributed pamphlets, and sowed the seeds of class struggle. For the nationalists, the communists were troublesome partners, but useful ones. Together, they could march against the warlords who bled China dry. Yet mistrust simmered beneath the surface. KMT leaders feared the communists' radicalism would undermine their vision of order. The communists, for their part, suspected the nationalists would discard them once they no longer needed them. Still, for a brief moment, the alliance seemed to work. KMT and communist troops marched side by side, banners fluttering as they pushed into regions long held by warlords. Ordinary Chinese, weary of endless conflict, greeted them with cautious hope. Perhaps, at last, unity was within reach. But unity built on convenience is fragile. Each victory brought new tensions. Who would govern the newly won territories? Who would control the new armies swelling with recruits? And most of all, who would shape the soul of modern China? For now, those questions remained unanswered. Yet even as the united front advanced, the seeds of betrayal and bloodshed were already being sown. In March 1925, the man who had carried the dream of China's rebirth for decades took his final breath. Sun Yat-sen, revered as the father of the Republic, died of cancer in Beijing. His funeral drew mourners from every corner of the fractured nation, intellectuals, soldiers, students, and peasants alike. Even those who had opposed him recognized that a towering figure had passed, a man whose vision had kept alive the hope of a united China. But dreams do not die with men. They pass into the hands of successors. And Sun's successor was Chiang Kai-shek, a soldier forged at the Whampoa Military Academy, hardened by battle, and ambitious beyond measure. Unlike Sun, whose idealism had defined the early Kuomintang, Chiang was pragmatic, calculating, and above all, determined to wield power without compromise. By 1926, Chiang had consolidated enough influence within the nationalist ranks to launch what would become known as the Northern Expedition, a massive military campaign to break the warlords' grip and unify China under the banner of the Kuomintang. His armies, disciplined and infused with Soviet training, advanced through the provinces, toppling one warlord regime after another. Ordinary people, long oppressed by local strongmen, often welcomed them as liberators. For a time, it seemed Sun's dream might finally be realized. But within the victorious marches lay hidden fractures. The alliance with the communists, so vital in the struggle against the warlords, was becoming unbearable to Chiang. He was no ideologue, but he understood power. To him, the communists were not just allies, they were a rival movement, growing too quickly, too radical, too dangerous. In 1927, as his forces approached Shanghai, Chiang made his move. Under the pretext of preventing a communist coup, he unleashed a wave of violence that would be remembered as the White Terror. Nationalist troops and hired gangs swept through the streets, arresting and executing communists, union leaders, and leftist sympathizers. Thousands were slaughtered in a matter of days. Thousands more fled into the countryside. The fragile unity of the United Front shattered in blood. For the communists, it was betrayal. For Chiang, it was necessity. He would tolerate no rival in his quest to control China. From that moment, the Kuomintang was his party, and he, its unchallenged general. In the aftermath, Chiang projected himself as the strong hand China needed, disciplined, modern, and ruthless. Yet beneath the victories of the Northern Expedition, beneath the parades and proclamations of unity, the wounds of betrayal festered. The communists who escaped into the hills carried with them not only the memory of slaughter, but also the conviction that the struggle for China was far from over. Sun Yat-sen's republic had died with him. In its place stood Chiang Kai-shek's military regime, proud, ambitious, and already at war with the very forces it had once called allies. The White Terror had left rivers of blood in Shanghai and other cities, but the communist movement did not die. Those who escaped the massacres retreated into the countryside, carrying with them both bitterness and determination. It was there, far from the cosmopolitan streets of Shanghai, that the Communist Party began to reinvent itself. Among the survivors was a relatively unknown figure named Mao Zedong. Unlike many of his comrades who came from urban intellectual circles, Mao understood the rhythms of peasant life. He believed that China's villages, not its cities, were the true engine of revolution. In his eyes, the countless millions of poor farmers, often dismissed as backward and powerless, were the sleeping giant who could overturn the old order. The years that followed became a crucible of guerrilla war. Communist bands, poorly armed but highly mobile, began harassing nationalist forces across the countryside. They struck supply lines, ambushed patrols, and melted back into the mountains and rice paddies before larger forces could catch them. For every defeat in open battle, they found strength in the loyalty of peasants who sheltered them, fed them, and in many cases, joined their ranks. Moscow, however, had other ideas. The Soviet Union saw China's communists as junior partners in the global revolutionary struggle. Their leaders, especially Li Lisan, urged bold offensives against the Kuomintang. In 1930, Li called for full-scale uprisings and direct assaults on the cities. The results were disastrous. Ill-equipped communist forces thrown against better-armed nationalist armies suffered devastating losses. This failure led to Li's downfall and the rise of a new leadership clique, Chinese intellectuals trained in Moscow, known as the 28 Bolsheviks. They were loyal to Stalin's line but inexperienced in the harsh realities of Chinese warfare. Their strategies often clashed with Mao's pragmatic emphasis on peasant-based guerrilla struggle. Meanwhile, the nationalists pressed their advantage. Chiang Kai-shek launched repeated encirclement campaigns, sending wave after wave of troops to crush communist bases. Villages suspected of aiding the Reds were burned, crops destroyed, civilians executed. For the peasants caught in between, the war was merciless. Support the communists and risk nationalist retaliation, or side with the nationalists and risk vengeance from the guerrillas. Yet despite the bloodshed, the communists endured. Every failed offensive, every burned village seemed only to harden their resolve. The stories of martyrs and heroes spread, weaving a narrative of sacrifice that drew new recruits. Mao, increasingly at odds with the Moscow reigned leadership, built his own following, arguing that survival depended not on reckless assaults, but on patient, grinding war rooted in the countryside. By the early 1930s, China was locked in a brutal stalemate. Warlords still controlled much of the land. The Kuomintang, though stronger than any rival, was stretched thin, bleeding resources in endless campaigns. And in the hills and fields, communist guerrillas fought on, battered but unbroken, waiting for the moment when fortune might tilt in their favor. As China bled from its civil strife, another shadow lengthened from the east. Japan, fresh from its victory in the Russo-Japanese War and flush with the spoils of Korea, cast its eyes on China's vast, resource-rich northeast, Manchuria. The region's fertile soil, iron deposits, and coal mines promised wealth, while its geography offered a springboard into the Chinese heartland. In 1931, the stage was set for Japan's next move. An explosion on the South Manchurian Railway, likely staged by Japanese officers themselves, provided the pretext. Almost overnight, 45,000 Japanese troops surged into Manchuria. The Kuomintang government in Nanjing, already consumed by campaigns against the communists, was powerless to resist. Orders were given for retreat rather than confrontation. For ordinary Chinese, the shock was unbearable. The humiliations of the 19th century had returned in cruel repetition. Cities fell without resistance. Foreign soldiers paraded through Chinese streets while the nationalist government, supposedly the guardian of the republic, stood by helplessly. Newspapers denounced the cowardice of the regime. Students marched in protest, demanding action. But Chiang Kai-shek's calculation was cold. He could not fight both the communists and the Japanese at once, and for the moment, he chose to focus on crushing his domestic enemies. Japan wasted no time consolidating its conquest. By 1932, it had established the puppet state of Manchukuo, placing the last Qing emperor, Puyi, on the throne as its figurehead. To Tokyo, this was propaganda gold, an image of restoring imperial tradition, masking the reality of naked occupation. For the Chinese, it was an insult layered on humiliation, proof that the dynasty they had overthrown was now being used as a puppet by invaders. The occupation was brutal. Villages were cleared, dissent crushed, and resources extracted to feed Japan's growing war machine. For peasants in Manchuria, life became a grim choice between collaboration, resistance, or annihilation. Guerrilla bands, some communist, some nationalist, sprang up in the countryside, harassing Japanese patrols. But without coordination or support, their efforts were little more than sparks against a storm. Internationally, Japan's aggression drew condemnation, but little action. The League of Nations issued protests, and in response, Japan simply walked away, confident that no Western power would challenge its expansion. The world's attention was fixed on the Great Depression, and China was left to face its enemy alone. For the Chinese people, Manchuria was not just a loss of territory. It was a symbol. It proved that their nation, torn by civil war and weakened by corruption, was vulnerable to foreign conquest once again. The outrage and despair that followed became fuel for the communists, who positioned themselves as the true defenders of the nation, even as Chiang hesitated. The invasion of Manchuria was not the climax of Japan's ambitions. It was only the beginning. And for China, it was a warning: unless its people united, worse was still to come. By 1934, Chiang Kai-shek believed he had found the key to finally eliminating the communists. His encirclement campaigns had grown more sophisticated, and with German military advisors at his side, he constructed fortified lines that squeezed the communist base in Jiangxi tighter and tighter. Food ran short, ammunition dwindled, and disease spread. The Red Army, trapped in the mountains, faced annihilation. The communist leadership, divided and desperate, gambled on. A single, almost suicidal idea: break through the encirclement and flee north. It was not a march of triumph, but of survival. And so began one of the most extraordinary odysseys in modern history, the Long March. In October 1934, nearly 100,000 men, women, and children set out. They carried rifles, banners, and little else, leaving behind the base they had nurtured for years. Almost immediately, disaster struck. At the Xiang River, nationalist forces blocked their path, and tens of thousands were cut down in brutal fighting. Half the army was lost in a matter of weeks. Survivors trudged forward, their resolve tested with every step. The journey would stretch more than 6,000 miles across some of the most unforgiving terrain in China. They scaled icy peaks in the Great Snowy Mountains, where frostbite claimed lives faster than bullets. They crossed the treacherous grasslands of Sichuan, a swampy wasteland where soldiers sank into mud or starved when food ran out. Hunger gnawed constantly. Many boiled leather straps to quiet their stomachs. Yet even in this torment, legends were born. Tales spread of soldiers linking arms to ford raging rivers, of women carrying children on their backs while marching endless miles, of comrades refusing to leave the wounded behind. These stories, retold later, became the bedrock of communist mythology, proof that their movement could endure any hardship. It was during this crucible that Mao Zedong rose to undisputed leadership. At a conference in Junyi in 1935, he challenged the Moscow-trained 28 Bolsheviks, whose strategies had nearly destroyed them. Mao argued for flexibility, for guerrilla tactics rooted in China's unique conditions, not rigid dogma imported from abroad. The desperate situation gave him the chance to prove himself, and the party rallied behind him. From this moment, Mao was no longer a marginal figure. He was the helmsman. When the ragged column finally reached the relative safety of Yan'an in the north, only about 10,000 remained. 9 out of 10 who had begun the journey were gone, dead from hunger, cold, or war. Yet for those who survived, the Long March was not merely retreat, but rebirth. They had endured trials beyond imagination. And in surviving, they believed themselves destined to triumph. For the people of China, news of the march spread like rumor and myth. Stories of endurance and sacrifice captured imaginations, especially among students and peasants who longed for leaders who would share their suffering. The nationalists had superior armies and foreign backing. But the communists had something far more potent, a narrative of struggle, survival, and destiny. The Long March had cost them nearly everything. But in the ashes of defeat, Mao and his followers found the foundation of their future. By the mid-1930s, the communists had survived the impossible, but China itself remained divided and vulnerable. To the east, Japan's armies advanced steadily from their base in Manchuria, probing deeper into Chinese territory. To many, the threat from Tokyo was clear: unless China united, its sovereignty would be consumed piece by piece. Yet Chiang Kai-shek remained fixated on crushing the communists. For him, the Red Menace was still the greater enemy. Even as Japanese soldiers marched ever closer, this strategy enraged many within his own camp. Generals in the nationalist armies who had fought bitterly against the Japanese could not understand why their leader seemed unwilling to resist foreign invasion with the same determination he showed against fellow Chinese. Chief among them was Zhang Xueliang, the young marshal of Manchuria, who had been forced to retreat south after Japan seized his homeland. For Zhang, the humiliation of losing Manchuria was personal, and he burned with the desire to fight back. The breaking point came in December 1936. Chiang traveled to the city of Xi'an to supervise yet another campaign against the communists, who had regrouped in the north. But instead of obedience, he was met with defiance. Zhang Xueliang, together with another general, Yang Hucheng, took a daring gamble. They arrested their own commander-in-chief. Chiang Kai-shek, the generalissimo of China, found himself held hostage by his own officers. For days, tension gripped the nation. Telegrams flew across China, and the world waited to see whether civil war would explode anew, or whether something unexpected might emerge. The communists, sensing opportunity, urged negotiation rather than vengeance. Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, recognizing the greater threat posed by Japan, called for unity. After days of fraught talks, a deal was struck. Chiang, under immense pressure from his captors and rivals, agreed to halt his campaigns against the communists and instead form a united front against Japan. The Xi'an incident shocked the nation. It revealed not only the fragility of Chiang's authority, but also the desperate yearning of soldiers and citizens alike for unity against foreign aggression. For the communists, it was a triumph without firing a shot. For Chiang, it was a bitter humiliation, but one he could not escape. In the cold December air of Xi'an, enemies became uneasy partners. The Second United Front was born, not out of trust, but out of necessity. Yet this fragile alliance would soon be tested in the crucible of total war. When Japan launched its full-scale invasion in July 1937, the fragile compromise forged in Xi'an was suddenly put to the test. Japanese troops swept across northern China, clashing with Chinese forces near Beijing and Tianjin before pushing further south. Within months, Shanghai was engulfed in ferocious fighting. The city's boulevards and foreign concessions, once symbols of cosmopolitan China, became battlefields littered with rubble and corpses. For the first time in decades, China's great rivals, the nationalists and the communists, fought under the same banner. The Second United Front was less a partnership than an uneasy truce, but it gave the nation a glimmer of unity. Propaganda posters showed soldiers of both parties marching shoulder to shoulder. In villages and cities, people spoke of defending the motherland together. Yet the reality was grim. The nationalist armies bore the brunt of the fighting, engaging Japan's modern, mechanized forces in desperate battles that often ended in disaster. In Nanjing, the nationalist capital, defenses crumbled by the end of 1937. The city fell to the Japanese in December, and what followed was one of the darkest chapters in modern history. The Nanjing massacre, weeks of mass executions, rapes, and atrocities, left hundreds of thousands dead. China's agony was laid bare for the world to see. The communists, by contrast, adopted a different strategy. While the nationalists were locked in pitched battles, Mao's forces waged guerrilla war behind enemy lines. They ambushed Japanese patrols, sabotaged railways, and organized peasants into militias. This allowed them to conserve strength while also presenting themselves as defenders of the common people. Villagers remembered that communist troops, unlike many warlords or nationalist soldiers, often paid for food instead of seizing it. Their reputation grew, and so did their numbers. Meanwhile, the United Front strained under suspicion. Chiang Kai-shek mistrusted the communists deeply, fearing that their growing influence in the countryside posed a greater long-term threat than Japan. Mao, equally wary, saw the war not only as a struggle against foreign invaders, but also as an opportunity to expand communist bases and recruit followers. Both sides fought the Japanese, but always with one eye on each other. Still, the war galvanized the nation. For ordinary Chinese, who had endured decades of division, there was a newfound sense of shared struggle. Students, merchants, farmers, and workers alike contributed what they could. Songs, plays, and newspapers rallied the population, calling the conflict a war of resistance that would decide China's fate. The cost was staggering. Cities were bombed, villages burned, millions displaced. Yet amid the horror, the idea of China as one nation, scarred but unbowed, took root more firmly than ever before. The Second United Front was born of coercion, mistrust, and necessity. But in the crucible of total war, it would reshape both the nationalists and the communists, setting the stage for the final struggle that lay beyond Japan's defeat. When the guns of the Second World War finally fell silent in 1945, celebrations erupted across the globe. In China too, there was relief. The long nightmare of Japanese occupation was over. But beneath the firecrackers and victory parades lay exhaustion and bitterness. The war had drained China to the bone. Millions were dead, millions more displaced, cities left in ruins, and farmland scarred by fire and flood. The nation that had survived invasion was now a shell of itself, staggering toward an uncertain future. For a brief moment, there was hope that the hard-won unity might last. American envoys, desperate to prevent China from sliding back into chaos, urged reconciliation between the nationalists and the communists. Negotiations were held, handshakes exchanged, promises made, but it was all illusion. The deep distrust forged over decades could not be undone by a few ceremonies. Chiang Kai-shek emerged from the war with the prestige of having led China as part of the Allied coalition. Yet his armies were battered and depleted, their morale shattered by years of defeat. His government, riddled with corruption, seemed more distant than ever from the ordinary people it claimed to serve. Inflation soared, black markets thrived, and officials grew fat while peasants starved. For many Chinese, the Kuomintang had not been saviors, but scavengers, enriching themselves while the nation bled. The communists, by contrast, had gained far more than survival. While the nationalists had fought large-scale battles and suffered staggering losses, Mao's forces had preserved their strength, striking selectively and retreating when needed. They emerged from the war not only with hardened guerrilla units, but also with something far more valuable, legitimacy. In village after village, peasants remembered that the Red Army had shared their hardships, organized them, and treated them with a measure of respect absent from most warlord or nationalist troops. Adding to this imbalance, the communists seized vast stores of Japanese weapons abandoned after surrender, rifles, artillery, even vehicles once used to occupy China were now turned against fellow Chinese. It was a grim irony, the invaders' tools would fuel the next phase of civil war. By late 1946, the illusion of peace had shattered. Skirmishes flared into battles, truces collapsed, and both sides hurled accusations of betrayal. Soon the fragile United Front was nothing more than a memory, replaced by open conflict. China had endured a century of humiliation, revolution, warlordism, and invasion. Now, on the eve of what should have been liberation, it faced yet another trial, a civil war that would determine not only who ruled, but what kind of China would emerge from the wreckage. The renewed civil war quickly became a struggle of momentum, and it was the communists who seized it. Though smaller in number than the nationalists, they fought with discipline, patience, and an uncanny ability to turn weakness into strength. Mao Zedong's strategy emphasized flexibility: avoid the enemy when strong, strike when weak, and let the people themselves become the source of power. For the Kuomintang, the war was a slow unraveling. Years of corruption had hollowed out Chiang Kai-shek's government. Soldiers went unpaid. Supplies vanished into the pockets of officials. And inflation made paper money worthless. Ordinary citizens, weary from years of suffering, increasingly turned against the regime that claimed to represent them. In contrast, the communists promised land reform, education, and justice, promises that resonated deeply with peasants who made up the majority of China's population. On the battlefield, the tide turned swiftly. Communist forces, newly armed with Japanese weapons left behind after 1945, launched a series of devastating campaigns. In Manchuria, they outmaneuvered nationalist troops, cutting supply lines and drawing them into ambushes. By 1948, entire nationalist armies were surrendering, not just to survive, but because their soldiers no longer believed in the cause for which they fought. The decisive blow came with the capture of two great cities, Beijing and Nanjing. In January 1949, the Red Army entered Beijing without resistance, its garrison surrendering rather than face further bloodshed. Months later, Nanjing, the nationalist capital, fell as well. With it collapsed the last illusion of Kuomintang supremacy. In October of that year, on the steps of Tiananmen, Mao Zedong declared the birth of the People's Republic of China. His words echoed across a nation that had endured a century of humiliation, revolution, and war. The crowds roared, waving flags and banners, believing that at last, China was united under a new dawn. For Chiang Kai-shek, defeat meant exile. Along with hundreds of thousands of loyal soldiers and officials, he fled across the Taiwan Strait, establishing a government in exile on the island of Taiwan. There, he proclaimed that his Republic of China still represented the true Chinese nation, a claim that, decades later, still lingers in the world's geopolitics. For those left on the mainland, the victory of the communists was both liberation and uncertainty. To many peasants, it was a moment of triumph, the promise of land and dignity after centuries of oppression. To others, especially urban elites, intellectuals, and former nationalists, it was the dawn of an unknown future under a leader whose vision was as uncompromising as it was revolutionary. The long struggle was over. The dynasty of emperors was gone. The Republic of Sun Yat-sen, shattered. And the dream of Chiang Kai-shek, exiled to an island. From the ashes of war and revolution, Mao's new China had risen. But whether it would heal the nation or wound it further was a question no one yet dared to answer. With victory secured in 1949, Mao Zedong stood as the unchallenged leader of the new People's Republic of China. For millions of peasants who had followed the Red Army or endured the long years of war, his triumph felt like deliverance. The imperial throne was gone. The Republic of Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek had failed. And in its place arose a revolutionary state promising equality, dignity, and renewal. Yet Mao's China would prove to be as turbulent as the decades that had preceded it. At first, the communists set about consolidating power. Land reform campaigns swept across the countryside, stripping landlords of their holdings and redistributing land to peasants. For many, it was the first time they felt ownership of the soil they had tilled for generations. But the reforms were not bloodless. Struggles and denunciations often spiraled into violence, with thousands of landlords executed as class enemies. The revolution that had been born in suffering now demanded more sacrifice. Mao's government also launched sweeping social changes. Women, long bound by the traditions of arranged marriage and patriarchal authority, were granted new rights. Education expanded, literacy campaigns spread, and the promise of a modern, industrial China beckoned. To many, these changes felt like a long-delayed rebirth, the closing of the chapter of humiliation that had begun with foreign invasions a century earlier. But Mao's rule was also marked by rigidity and ideology taken to extremes. In the late 1950s, the Great Leap Forward sought to catapult China into industrial modernity by mobilizing the masses to build furnaces in villages and remake agriculture overnight. Instead, it unleashed one of the deadliest famines in human history. Tens of millions perished, the countryside scarred not only by hunger but also by despair. The suffering deepened again in the 1960s with the Cultural Revolution. Mao, fearful of losing control, unleashed students and young radicals, the Red Guards, to purge society of bourgeois elements. Temples were desecrated, schools thrown into chaos, intellectuals humiliated or beaten to death. Families were torn apart as children denounced parents, and loyalty to Mao became the measure of survival. To his supporters, he was a visionary who refused to let the revolution ossify. To his critics, he was a tyrant who sacrificed millions to maintain his grip on power. And yet, despite the tragedies, Mao's image as the founding father of modern China endured. Propaganda posters showed him as a radiant sun shining over fields of wheat and smiling workers. For many Chinese, particularly the poor who had gained land and dignity, he remained a hero. For others, especially those who suffered under his campaigns, he became the architect of nightmares. When Mao died in 1976, his 30-year reign left behind a nation transformed yet wounded. China was no longer the sick man of Asia, torn apart by warlords and foreign powers. It was a sovereign state, united and defiant. But it was also a nation haunted by famine, purges, and the ghosts of countless dead. Even today, Mao's legacy divides opinion. Was he the man who restored China's pride and independence, or the leader who delayed its modernization through disastrous policies? The truth lies somewhere between. What cannot be denied is that he shaped China as no one else could, turning a fractured empire into a modern state, though at a cost that remains staggering. From the twilight of the Qing to the dawn of the People's Republic, China's journey had been one of humiliation, resilience, and rebirth. Its people endured dynastic collapse, foreign invasion, civil war, and revolution. And through it all, the dream of unity survived, reshaped, battered, but unbroken. Mao's China was not the end of history, but a beginning. And its consequences still echo across the world.